Let's start the conversation here, Murtaza. How we got into this mess is possibly a very long and complicated story. We've seen some steps very recently to sort of, possibly the first ones to potentially unwind this. Let's talk about that. But if you were to sort of give us the highlights, how did we end up here in the first place?
So the question is that this is something that has bothered me for a while, whether it was a question of misfortune or mismanagement. And the politicians, when you see them debating, they say if you do the blame game, we have to go back to Vijay. But I don't think we need to go back that far. Basically, since independence, we have been running large fiscal deficits. We have been fiscally profligate. But perhaps there was a case in the 1960s, 70s to run large primary deficit, which means revenue minus expenditure without interest. Because we had a relatively young population, there was a population explosion. And then we had to give social services, education, etc. So that absorbed a lot of resources, and we were developing a human capital. But over the last 30 years or so, basically the conflict also impacted fiscal resources. So not only were we not able to grow as fast as we should have, but the government expenditure was on military and then reconstruction. Every time there was a bomb or terrorist attack. But I would think that since the end of the conflict, the misallocation of resources got accentuated. That even at the end of the conflict, our debt to GDP was close to 100%, but more it was domestic debt. So what we did is we kind of inflated it towards the end of the conflict. Inflation was running quite high, and we were able to grow the economy much faster than the interest cost. And then after a few years, after the recovery, after the end of the conflict, the growth started slowing. The growth model was flawed. So we were trying to grow non-tradable sectors, and we were borrowing international capital and allocating it domestically. So that was not generating the kind of returns basically to keep paying it back. And this was quite obvious by the middle of the last decade. And then there was a change in government, Yahapalana came. So I suppose they kind of understood the problem, but they didn't have the political stability. As you know, there was infighting. And it was just a holding on operation. There was an IMF program, etc. And they had given some targets for us to keep at a primary balance surplus. But the growth started slowing, and then you had a lot of unfortunate. So the misfortune then kicked in 2015, 2016. We had a weakness in rain. Actually, it was 2016 and first half of 2017 failed monsoons. Then you had a constitutional coup in 2018, and then the Easter bombings. All these shocks slowed the economy. But the debt basically was still there, and the fisc, the revenues, although they were increasing, they were not increasing at the rate that we needed. So one problem with revenue is that you need a growing economy to collect more revenue. Because it's only when you have growth that people will make more profits, people have more variable bonuses, people will consume discretionary items. These are the items that have more taxation in it. So when this government changed, it was a massive blunder that they did the tax cuts. And about 3 months after the tax cut, COVID set in, and that slowed the economy. So now you have a situation that you have very high expenditure, which is going up because you have to spend on COVID measures. And your economy is slowing because, you're shutting down most of the economic activity due to COVID. And your taxation is coming down. And as a mechanism to preserve foreign exchange, you basically start even banning items that had large amount of taxation, like vehicles. So vehicles was a category that used to cost us about $1 billion, but you'd have almost 200 billion rupees worth of taxes collected in 2018. So all that goes away. And therefore what happens is that now you're trying to preserve foreign exchange and cut imports. But at the same time, you are continuing to service your debt, and your rating has been cut. So we never borrowed all this money to be able to pay it back. It was about that we would convince the next guy to lend us again to pay the guys who gave it before.
Sure.
So the rollover, we couldn't do the rollover. And it was quite evident by mid 2020 because our bonds were already trading at 70 cents to the dollar. It was signaling to us that, we were not good for the money, and they started cutting our rating. So when they cut our first rating to CCC, we were B minus, because it was game over by that time. But there were a few policy makers, and I would call them finally the Gang of Four, who basically gave a different narrative. Either they had some other agenda or they were in complete denial or delusional. They just kept on believing that this is a short-term problem. So they kept believing that it was a liquidity crisis when it was a solvency crisis. So they used our reserves, which was quite substantial when COVID started, $6 to $7 billion. And they kept on trying to keep on paying the debt. And we were unable to roll over the debt. And then, COVID went into first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave. So we just couldn't get out of it. And the narrative that was being told to the leaders was that it's a problem of tourism. And that if this tourism comes back, that we lost out $4 billion, which itself is incorrect because there's no correct way to measure it. It's just an estimate based on the average spend of $180 a day, which is way too high. But continuously assured that this is a problem with tourism when it was not. And then you had huge policy blunders, you had low taxation and low interest rates. And that just created the environment for a perfect storm. So the domestic economy, in spite of import controls, people went on a spending binge in 2021. Most categories saw record growth. And then by early 2022, money had run out, and then the crisis now has become a full-blown crisis.
You talked about the recent past here, but I'm going slightly back, and you talked about the misfortune that we faced. At the same time, we were very active in the global commercial market for debt, and you're suggesting that there was a significant misallocation of those resources when they came in. How crucial was that? We tend to focus on the recent. How crucial was the misallocation of resources?
Although the focus is on some of these vanity projects, and they're quite stark. Take the city of Colombo, things like the Lotus Tower, etc., $100 million. The thing is that those things all added up, but that was not where the major misallocation happened. The major misallocation was happening in the SOEs, that we were not pricing them cost reflective. So whatever we spent on Hambantota and Matala, it's unfortunate that they were the wrong priorities because they were never part of the national physical plan. Those were never the priorities. But what we lost in terms of mispricing electricity, mispricing fuel, expanding the government service. So for example, when GR's government came in, I believe they added 75,000 to 100,000 new people. You were providing jobs to people when jobs don't exist. You were creating employment. So all of this is where the major misallocation happened. And then you had also crowding out, that the government was interfering in so many segments of the real economy. And when you misprice resources, for example, we have been mispricing oil, which is our single largest import, for over 20 years. Because we don't keep up with global prices, we don't adequately tax them as much as even what we tax every other product. We should have been adding corrective taxes because there are externalities. So resources were misallocated. And
So basically, some of that or most of that foreign capital that we borrowed were allocated to loss-making state ventures that were not essentially pricing their services.
So we were subsidizing. Because if you look at the capital budget, although they say capex, about 50% of the capex budget is capital transfers.
Okay.
They're not investments in brick and mortar.
Okay.
So those capital transfers are like recurrent expenditure. So you were subsidizing. The electricity price was not revised since 2012. there was some fuel surcharge that was up to end of 2014, but that was taken out in 2015. So the tariffs went back to what it was in 2012 once you took the surcharge out. Even when and inflation relatively in that decade was quite low. They kept it in the middle single digits. That was a great success story actually. But still there was 5 to 6% in, and we didn't revise the electricity price. So even the fuel prices, in most South Asian countries, their fuel prices were 30, 40, 50%. And it just is beyond my understanding of why your single biggest import is not correctly priced. It's not like we're giving healthcare services or education and you can say that there's a case there to subsidize. Everybody can't afford it. But why would you subsidize, petrol and diesel? And subsidies come in two ways. One is, until recently, they were even selling below the cost price, world market price. But most of the time, it was a tax subsidy that we would have very low levels of taxation, and even that they would not collect. So although they would charge, the retail price was not cost reflecting. So one just doesn't understand the politics behind fuel. When we can't eat it, we can't breathe it, it's just we put it into vehicles, and it's a very inefficient. The automobile has been a great innovation, but the reality is that, typical man may weigh between 70 and 80 kilos, a woman may be between 60 and 70 kilos. But you need a vehicle that weighs about 2,000 kilos to move that one individual. So you're putting an enormous amount of energy to have mobility. At least you should price it properly.
So we've started making those adjustments as on the eve of this recording. There's been a significant revision of this tax structure, reversing most of the tax cuts implemented just ahead of the pandemic striking. Can you take us through that? Are we doing enough? Are these the right moves?
So the recent price changes to diesel and petrol were welcome and in the right direction. So we have finally broken this misguided notion that diesel is the poor man's fuel, which is not true, because there's about 3.5 million motorcycles on the road and a little bit less than 1 million trishaws on the road. Those are not rich people's vehicles. So a lot of middle income or lower middle income people use petrol. So now we have priced it relatively similarly. But the problem is that the current price, of course, yesterday again the Brent price went up, and probably each of these have to be increased by about another 20 rupees. Diesel has hit $160 a barrel, which is a record basically. Brent has hit 120. So what has happened is, because there's a shortage, there's an issue in the refinery market globally. The refinery margins, which are normally about $5 a barrel, is now about $25, $30, which is at a record level. So not only is the crisis being exacerbated because of high crude oil prices, but very high condensate prices also, diesel, petrol, kerosene. So the thing with the taxes is that there's still tax discounts going on. Even these absolute levels, there is an element of ad valorem as a percentage of the value. And then there are quantity taxes, a rupee value per litre basically. They are not recovering the full amount of taxes that on both on diesel and petrol, there are tax discounts. There's about like a 25 rupee discount, I think, duty discount. So that has to be recovered. But of course, now that the prices have gone up substantially, we may have to wait till world prices weaken. It might go up during the summer, but once it weakens, it will be a big mistake for us to reduce the prices. What they should do is to recover the tax discounts that they have given. Now, there was an announcement made yesterday about increasing the tax rates, and there are a large number of elements. I'm afraid that it is in one way welcome that it is in the right direction, but I'm afraid that it's not the way that I would have done it, basically. And my thinking is this, that fundamentally they have increased the rates, but let's take how generally a middle income country like Sri Lanka would tax its economy. So the heavy lifting has to come from VAT. And this was from an IMF document that a middle income country like us typically should be collecting close to 6% through VAT.
Equivalent of 6% of GDP.
Right. We were down to about 1.5%, very low. And even as a percentage of the total tax revenue, last year was below 20%, when it should be a much higher figure. The VAT is a very, not a distortionary tax. It doesn't cascade because you get input credit. And we should be at a rate of about 15%. We went down to 8% and we have taken it back to 12%. I think it was a mistake. I mean, the intention is to do it in 2 steps. I think it's a mistake that they are doing it in 2 steps. They should have just done it and got it over with, because then there's an expectation that the VAT rate will be again increased. One shot they should have taken it up to 15%. And the concerns about inflation and how people can afford it, but tomato prices have gone up 200%. So it's not that we put VAT on food, but everything is zooming up.
You said the share of VAT in Sri Lanka's tax collection was 20%. That is excluding VAT on imports?
No. All taxes put together, if I'm not mistaken, it is less than 20%, its share of all taxes, which is fairly low. So because we have PAL and we have cess and we have duty, we have so many. So what we should be doing is that there are, the 3 ways you can collect taxes. Taxes on what you buy, taxes on what you own, and taxes on what you earn. Those are the 3 basic ways. Let's examine one at a time. So taxes what you buy, the main tax should be coming from VAT. We should not be relying on duties and PALs and then cess, which is actually an export size tax. Most people don't know what cess stands. It's an acronym, a Commodity Export Subsidy Scheme. Now, how did Commodity Export Subsidy Scheme go from the export side to the import side? I always wonder how that happened, because the thinking behind cess was that you will tax primary commodity exports. This is the colonial economy, and use that money to basically develop value addition, etc. So we still have cess on tea and we have cess on rubber, etc. But it has now come on to the import side and is being used as a protectionist tariff. It's a para tariff. Then we have something called PAL, Port Authority Levy, which basically only is applicable if you cross the border. So what you are doing is you're significantly disadvantaging imports. So you are making a conscious policy decision that you are creating an autarkic kind of highly protectionist kind of economy, which is the complete wrong thing, because it's a contradictory strategy that you can't export and protect imports at the same time. Because any exports, you're never going to add 100% value addition. Few things we can do in Sri Lanka, like tea, we pretty much grow the tea in Sri Lanka. So at a very high level of value addition. Of course, the value addition comes down when you start getting packaging, etc., because that's mostly all imported. But if you look at basically the indirect taxes, which is like almost 80%, we should move towards mainly VAT. We should put VAT on as much of the economy as possible. So if you assume a VAT rate of 15% and we apply it on 40% of GDP, and if you assume GDP is a measure of value addition, you will get 6%. So it's 40% into 15% will give you 6%. Of course, you can apply VAT. You can't put VAT on exports, but you can put VAT on imports. So it is technically very, very possible. And one of the things is that we have a fairly large informal economy. It is estimated something like 70%. So although we measure GDP, the big firms, the formal firms that you see basically are not the bulk of the economy. There was an industry survey done basically back in 2013-14. and it showed that there's about 1 million establishments in Sri Lanka, and about 91% of that are less than 4 people. So if we go back to how we should have gone about looking at the VAT, I mean, it was about 12 million was the threshold, revenue threshold. We took it up to 300, that's 25 times more. And now they have brought it down to 120 million, which is too high. Because IMF's recommendation, according to a research paper that I read, is around $50,000 to $100,000 revenue. Actually, revenue is not the best way to set the threshold, because we should do value addition, because revenue for a trading company is very different to revenue to a service company. Now, the argument is that at 120 million that you can collect like 85%, So why bother about the effort, whether the effort is more than what you collect. The first thing is that from a tax culture perspective, you really want as many people as possible to pay. And due to the very high informality, especially like take, for example, in the tourism sector, etc. I mean, if it's 15%, then there is going to be a big price difference between people who pay the VAT and who don't. You are distorting. And you want generally the larger firms to succeed, because hopefully they have higher productivity. So if they have a higher productivity, hopefully they can offer lower prices, etc. When you set the threshold so high at like 120 million, I mean 300 million was outrageous, but even 120 million is too high, even if you assume the depreciation that has happened, because you're going to have people then creating more and more small firms owned by the same person to just avoid the VAT, this thing. If you had set it at about like 25 million or 30 million, it's too hard to do, etc.
Just to clarify one thing, did you just mention that should we want 6% of GDP equivalent on VAT, that our VAT rate should be 40%?
No, 15%.
15%.
And you apply 15% or 40% of GDP.
Right.
You should be collecting on 40% worth of GDP activity.
Right. Got it.
So there's 60% you can't, because there's too small, agriculture, there's a lot of things. You can't be taxing schools and things like that. No. So basically, this is very doable. Even developing countries at our level of development do. But we just seem to think that you cannot do it. Either they think that they cannot, or it's a convenient way, because there is a lot of extractive elements, Shamindra, who have captured this economy. So they probably, or people didn't think through it. So that's just the size of the firm. Then you have to apply to as many items as possible, what I said about 40% of GDP. So it's not on the size of the firm, but I give the famous example that, laptops, tablets, mobile phones, I mean, there's only a 5% PAL on it. Now, I don't know the recent changes, whether they have been included. I mean, there was a thinking that, no, this is IT and we have to encourage it. But there's a big difference between a mobile phone that costs $200 and an iPhone that costs $1,000. You'd have VAT on all these items. I can understand that you don't put VAT on food, but we didn't put VAT on restaurants. We didn't put VAT on tourism. And now these industries can't really complain, although it is challenging for them. The currency has gone down by 75%. So in rupee terms, they will be, I mean, the dollar rates, most of these places have maintained their dollar rates. No? So in rupee terms, they are significantly beneficial. So VAT basically should be doing the heavy lifting in our economy. Sure. We need to get to more than 14% primary balance. To get a primary balance of 2%, at least our taxes have to go to 14% of GDP. We are below 8%. So this has to give us more than 6%. And I'm afraid that not enough exempted categories have been bought in, and the threshold is too high. Then let's talk about corporate taxes. So far in the corporate taxes, more than 50% of the corporate tax is coming from the financial sector, because we have put financial VAT on them, then we have put high corporate taxes. It's not an exempted sector. Now, it was considered a cow that could be milked because it's an oligopolistic structure. It's easy, high collection, how many banks you have, like 24 banks or something. So it's easy. They have a large taxpayer unit and they can audit them. The problem is that our banks are now in serious trouble, because the government basically, these euro bonds or what we call ISBs, there's huge impairment that is coming there. Second thing is with this currency depreciation, that their dollar loans in rupee value has gone up significantly. So the capital adequacy ratios basically between the end of last year and the first quarter in many banks significantly came down. Large impairments, still much more impairments to take than private sector loans. So the banks now are not in a position basically to pay very high tax burden, like almost 50% they're paying when you have 24% tax and 18%. Now, if they're planning to take the tax rate, corporate tax rate to 30%, these people's tax burden is going to go up even more. And this is an environment in which basically they have to have more internal accruals. They have to earn their way out. We will have to practice regulatory forbearance because the state doesn't have the money to basically recapitalize the banks because it's the state defaulting basically. So you can't take from one pocket and put it in another pocket. It's not going to work basically. So we have to allow the banks to earn their way out of this. And we have to allow them not only to get a rate of return to cover their cost of capital, but more than that basically. So we can't tax the banks anymore. We'll probably have to reduce. But there is a significant corporate sector outside the banking sector. And we have given extremely generous tax concessions without any kind of scientific analysis. The Strategic Development Act they had, on that they have given to everybody and anybody, all these large projects. I think we have to sunset all these things. I mean, there is a school of thought saying that, once you give an agreement, how can you renege? But when you default on your foreign creditors, you are reneging on a promise to pay, right? Sure. So here now, in our revival, basically, we have to basically bring the entire tax base. We have to widen the tax base of the country to capture all these entities. And it's not that, because anyway, globally now there's a minimum, a tax rate of 15%. There is something called the BEPS framework, base erosion profit shifting. Sri Lanka is not a signatory to that. But that only means that our companies who have subsidiaries overseas, if they are benefiting from a tax concession, they will not be taxed in Sri Lanka. But any foreign company who is located in Sri Lanka, which is above 750 million euro threshold, and coming from a country, all the OECD countries signed off, if we don't deduct the tax here, they will have to pay the tax there. So it makes no sense. So my suggestion is that we apply a minimum alternate tax to those people who are under tax concessions, tax holidays.
One thing we previously did was had something called economic service charge, which is offsettable against your corporate tax if you are liable. But in the instance where you have a tax holiday, that is something you incur. Is that not a simpler, faster way to do this?
Well, the problem with that is it's a proportion of turnover.
Yes.
And if you're losing money, you have to pay.
Yes.
So then they try to have dual rates depending on whether you're a service business. We simply should just apply this minimum alternate tax, which is also there in the United States, where they have a lot of concessions, etc. The minimum alternate tax is applicable. So we should have applied a minimum alternate tax for those entities that we have gone and given these generous tax holidays. And we have to basically then apply one rate for everybody else. Now we are still going to go ahead with 15%, then manufacturing 18%, then somebody else at 30%, somebody else at 40%. So, basically it seems like, for example, the IT industry, it's outrageous, zero. And even this, so the IT industry has been growing. Even the industry basically says that we can't keep up, we need more human resources. Now, if you are growing basically and you're doing well, taxes is something you pay when you are successful. So from a moral perspective, it's immoral not to pay taxes. And when you have and then if you are a high income earner, you should be paying. That's the principle of a progressive rate. And in Sri Lanka, 36% of the national income accrues to the top 10% of households. the top 20% accrues to 51%. So you start exempting industries that are doing well, who are getting dollar-based income, revenues. If these people don't pay taxes, these are the same very people who go to the government and say, I need more trained people, I need certain resources. How are we going to provide, education and higher education and public services? One of the other challenges even the IT industry has is, okay, we want infrastructure so that our people can go home, travel to work. They can't all be work from home. Yeah, it may be a solution in the short term, but it's a fundamental thing that everybody pays taxes. And you cannot be, like gems have been exempted. The argument is that N.M. Pereira exempted it in the 1970s because it's a small item that visibility is very, that's about a tax administration issue. But your policy should not be exempting. Nothing should be exempted. Everybody should be paying.
If IT exports are in the region of $1 billion plus, there's possibly several $100 million worth of tax that is
there's several $100 million worth of profits out there. Right. So even if we're going to have a flat rate of tax of 24%, there are tax deductions also. The government can give tax credits, which is a much better instrument. So I'd like to elaborate how a tax credit works. So tax credit is a defined amount of money that you can offset against taxes. So for example, you say that, okay, if you say that I'm going to give you a training tax credit and say the tax credit is 100,000 rupees. Why a government will give that is because, if I'm the owner of a company and I train you, I can't keep you with me. The moment I train you, your market value is going to go up.
Sure.
So what if you leave me? So it's a classic market failure problem. So companies are not incentivized to train people because you're basically showing them the door. So by a tax credit, what you do is the government then is either paying for it or subsidizing. And the government can justify it because as long as they don't leave the country, somewhere they have to pay their taxes to. So that person that got trained is going to be a higher income earner and therefore fall into a higher income bracket and pay taxes. So from a corporate perspective, most of our corporates should not be exempted. Everybody should be paying so that then the rate is going to be lower. Now what has happened is that they have taken the headline rate up to 30%. So we could have actually maintained it at 24% and got everybody to pay. Then you'll have more people. So then you're not picking winners and losers. Some people are not advantaged over other people, So, if you manufacture something, you pay 18%. Now, if you take a supermarket, the thing is that they play a huge role in distributing goods, in transporting, logistics, etc. That would be categorized as trading. That's just, but in terms of economic value, if you get food from the farmer to the consumer, that is doing a huge service as more as, you get caught up in semantics and say, what is manufacturing? It's very silly because it's a transformation of inputs to outputs. Whether you do it in a factory or do you do it through the value chain, you're still creating value. So the concept of having different rates is completely flawed. You shouldn't be fiddling around with the rate. The rate should be the same. You could have other instruments to incentivize behavior. Then you come to personal taxes. Now we had 3 bands before. We had 6%, 12 and 18. We have now gone and increased to 8 bands. So very, very small changes, etc. To do the maths itself is difficult. Of course, hopefully computers will do the maths. And it makes no sense that you have taken some people from the 4% rate to 32%. It should be 8%. So the problem is that now, depending on how you do your business, most of the establishments in Sri Lanka are not companies. They are proprietorships and partnerships. You'll have a lot more entities that are proprietorships and partnerships. Now, you could be doing the same business from a partnership or proprietorship compared to a company, and because the personal tax rate is much higher now at the top marginal rate, you are going to be paying more tax. So for example, you could be exporting tea, and if it's categorized as an export product, you would be paying 15%. But if you do it as a partnership or proprietorship, you'd be paying 32%. So what they should have done is, depending on the source, if they're going to have differential rates. So what I feel is that taxes are biggest issue, and I don't think we do taxation well. My advice, the takeaway here is, keep it simple, keep as much flat rate as possible, and get as many people to pay. Because it is important that Sri Lankans feel they're paying taxes, because it is said, Professor McMoore says, that societies who pay taxes enjoy better governance. And finally, you tax what you own. And the biggest asset class in Sri Lanka has been real estate, property. Look at the city of Colombo. Look at the number of buildings that have come up. In Colombo district, since the end of the conflict, Colombo district, not even Colombo city, the prices have gone up 200%. Right? So and it's only local taxes that are collected through rates and taxes. So here is a large capital asset that should be taxed, because how do you pay for physical upkeep of the city? And we have better roads, we have better infrastructure, no doubt about it. But all of this, somebody has to pay for it, right? So either you get the user to pay, you can do that in certain issues like in the highway, etc., if it is controlled. But you can't be putting tolls on every flyover, basically, every roundabout that you do up. All this is costing enormous amount of money. So we have to also move into the thing that we tax what you own. Of course, but you should do that above a certain level of value, so that you exempt the large amount of the population. But at least the high income, as I said, 36% of national income accrues to the top 10% of households. I would guess that 50% of the wealth is amongst the top 10%. So that's my kind of thinking on this tax issue. Of course, there is also non-tax revenue, and there are three forms of non-tax revenue. Fee income. So if you take even highways, what you pay to go on highway, for many years they haven't revised the tariff. Look at where inflation is, and look at if you take the fuel cost. If you go from here to Mathura and you take the fuel cost, what is the highway charge? It's a small amount now, right? So people can afford to pay more. They should be paying more. That's just one example. Then you have to basically, this habit of giving things at discounts should stop. And basically, the government owns 84% of the land. So we could ask the government, what is the return that you're getting on your property? You are sitting on the largest asset in the country. So if you're going to put property taxes on private land, you must at least ensure that your state land, etc., where you are dominating. So, 50% of that you cannot use because it will be the mountains, the rivers, the roads, etc. But there's a lot of other things that you can yield, right?
What's your view on capital gains tax? Where does that fall in this categorization?
So capital gains, basically, if you assume an entity that goes on accumulating its retained earnings, its value will go up, right? So if you say that you have to pay a capital gains, you are then taxing it 2 times, because the retained earnings is after taxes. So there are 2 fundamental. My view is you shouldn't be putting capital gains tax, certainly on shares, and you shouldn't be putting dividend tax, because the dividends are declared from after tax profits, which have already paid taxes. So why tax again?
But there is a deductible, right? Dividend taxes?
No, I mean, it's just a one-off. It's a withholding. So what you are doing is, Shamindra, you want more risk capital in the economy.
Right.
So how those tax proposals came yesterday is the dividend will have a withholding tax of 14%, and the underlying earnings are taxed now at 30%. In not all categories, but most categories. But interest will only have a withholding tax of 5%. And interest is a deductible. So different classes of capital, the higher risk capital, you are disadvantaging massively. And in terms of seniority, the debt capital is a senior capital, and you are allowing the entire interest to be deducted. And the interest in the hands of the owner basically will only have a 5% withholding tax, which is the final tax.
If you look at real estate, this has been a favorite investment asset for fairly wealthy Sri Lankans who have the liquidity to buy and hold. Wouldn't a capital gains tax work there better?
So in that particular case, unlike in the case of companies, the value is basically, it is the underlying, it's not the accumulation of earnings, right? So in that particular case, putting a capital gains tax is fine. But in most places, what they do is they give you an inflation adjustment.
An indexation.
Right? Yeah. So here it's at 10% basically. So that's only if it's an investment property. If a property is part of your business and you sell the property, it will be considered as business profits. Right. So say I was sitting, so the thing is that there has been a huge appreciation in land prices, and we already have that 10%. I don't know how many people are paying because it's grandfathered up to 2017 prices. But certainly that there is a case for capital gains on land, but there isn't a case for capital gains on shares unless it's very short-term profits, because then it is more speculative in nature. And therefore, if you apply a capital gains tax, it's fine.
Okay. So, Murtaza, we've discussed expenditure, we've discussed revenue in fair
Maybe
detail.
A few things on expenditure.
Sure.
So, on the expenditure side, the thing that's never discussed is that functionally, your single biggest line item in expenditure is defense and security and law and order, something like more than 400 billion. So as a citizen, I'd like to ask this question that is 13 years since the end of the conflict. Do we need such a large military? The Sri Lankan army is bigger than the British army. And the UK is over 3.5 times the size of population. It's a global power. Why are we having such a large military? It's a large amount, a standing army. And similarly, we have a large navy. Now, are these people, is the nature of their jobs in defense of the nation, or they're doing other stuff basically? And it's high cost labor. Now, if you're using the military to do construction and then using the navy to do construction, etc. I mean, a comparative person working outside the navy, for example, would be earning significantly lower. The total cost, because they have pension benefits, they're kept in camps, they're fed, uniforms, everything. So this particular thing, and the money is not going into armaments and defense capabilities. There's a lot of salaries. Somebody had done the analysis that although the entire defense establishment accounts for like 1/3 of the total public sector, that time it was about 1.3 million. Now I think the number has gone up to about 1.5. But the whole defense establishment and the police all put together about 400,000 people. It accounts for 50% on the wage bill. This came out of one study. So we have to reassess that, can we afford to maintain such a large defense and security and law and order establishment?
How does this impact GDP growth? I mean, if we freed up that money, can it generate greater growth for everybody else?
So one thing is you free up the labor.
Sure.
Right? That there is a labor shortage, male labor shortage, and you're pretty much in your prime age when you're in the military. So you are having a real crowding out effect, that you're taking away people from the real economy. And there are certain segments of the private sector, like the construction, etc., that are a shortage of labor. So the first benefit is that if you downsize the size of the military, the sheer number of the standing army, you can go to a reserve army, you will create more availability of labor, right? The second thing is that the amount that you spend, the first thing, Shamindra, is you can repurpose it for equipment. right? So do we need 400? I'm told that there are 400 army camps. I stand to be corrected. Do you need so many? Can you deal with half the amount? And then can you buy equipment that is really needed for our defense, etc.? But obviously, the obvious place to put it is in education and healthcare, which is significantly underfunded.
And then we are into a discussion now about how do you generate growth in this economy. I mean, we can try to shrink to fit the challenge, or we can try to also alternatively try to grow out of this.
So the growing out of it is the only solution.
Right.
You can't cut yourself, So what we will have to do is that there are two ways to grow. Either you create more jobs, you get more people employed. So we have to have massive job creation, and we have to create a massive productivity revolution in this country. So there are, for example, the agricultural sector, which employs over 20% of the labor force. Hugely low productivity. If you take all the crops, if you take paddy, if you take tea, if you take rubber, if you take coconut, our land yields are significantly lower than our neighbors or many Asian countries. To cite an example, like the rubber, the yield on our rubber plantations, or even with the smallholders, is only about 950 kilograms per hectare, while the Southeast Asian average is close to 1,500. Right? So what's so different about Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia? Why can a rubber plantation in those countries yield 50% more than we? So obviously we are doing something wrong. Either the trees are too old or the methodologies are wrong. Similarly in coconut, I think we are doing, it depends now. Last 2 years we have had very good harvest. But if you compare to, say, India, Pollachi, etc., they probably produce 30% more nuts per tree than we do, 20%, 30%. Now, the answers to how to improve this actually lie in Sri Lanka. So, this is a national average that I gave you. But you will find there are rubber plantations that are more than 1,500 in Sri Lanka. There will be coconut trees that will give you more than 70, 80. So it would depend on the species, it depends on the soil conditions, it depends on the management. So we have a big productivity tail, that you have a lot of low productivity enterprises, and at the head of the productivity distribution, very high productivity entities. And you will find that in many parts of the economy. So if you really count where the people are working, it's not about dreaming of having electronic factories. I mean, that at the margin that will help, and those are the new areas we have to go into. But we have 500,000 people in a labor force involved in transportation, right? That's a labor force survey indicates 500,000 people. So I would think that if you take out the bus drivers and the conductors and the lorry drivers, they're probably close to about 400,000 people whose primary employment is treasure driving, right? So it's about either we have to create new jobs that move people away from these industries, because there may be limits to improving productivity. So the Ubers and the Pygmies have certainly improved the productivity, because idle time is coming down, and that way they can earn much more. But then there might not be a need for so many. We can shrink these things. You take construction sector, even if you take retailing, if you take the typical kade, and if you look at the efficiency, the entire family is probably occupied. I'm sure that from a revenue per square foot area or revenue per person, supermarket's productivity ratios are double, treble better than the average grocery store in Sri Lanka. So there's a whole segment, brownfield segments of the economy, including the government, etc., that are very low productivity. So we have to create a massive productivity revolution in this country, and the key driver of productivity is competition. So we have to allow the more highly productive units, and that's why my concern about taxation and VAT setting the higher threshold, etc., because this will now advantage the smaller guy basically and disadvantage the larger guy. The larger guy, you shouldn't be feeling too sorry for the smaller guy, because the larger guy in a highly competitive environment hopefully is driving down consumer prices. So the consumer is going to benefit from lower prices, which one of the things that supermarkets are trying to do, because as long as they can't price gouge and there's a lot of competition, they can't retain those gains,
Are our incentive structures not geared towards shifting people away into more productive areas?
Yes, so there is an issue, what economists call competitive neutrality. So whether basically your tax system, your regulatory system, everything permits a level playing field so that the more productive units in the economy, succeed. Now, there is a misplaced conception that the big guy is trampling the small guy. But that's only on the production side. But we are all consumers. So, if the more productive entities in the economy succeed, and provided that there is sufficient competition out there, we are all going to benefit as consumers. That is the only way to drive down prices. You can't drive down prices through price controls. This is not going to work. So, we have to create a huge productivity revolution, and we have to create a lot of new jobs. The new jobs have to come by females. That female participation rate in the economy is only about 32%. And if you looked at the Article 4 report of the IMF, they're also talking about the low female participation. So if you even get them close to 50%, right? Southeast Asian countries are as high as 60%, 70%. If we get it up to 50%, there's 1 million more females in the labor force. And that basically will create a lot more economic output. And that will have to come by creation of new industries, new foreign direct investment coming into Sri Lanka to create a whole bunch of new products and services for export, etc., that we don't even have. Because one problem that Sri Lanka has is, if you look at our export basket over the last 20 years, it's the same products. Of course, the value has gone up, but we haven't transformed ourselves. If you look at Vietnam, which is a stellar success story, the products that dominated the export basket 20 years are no longer the same products that dominate today. Today, mobile phones is their biggest item.
We've covered a broad perspective here, Murtaza. Is economic governance something that also should be part of the mix of strategies or policies that will help Sri Lanka out of this crisis?
So it is fundamentally, that's why we have gone wrong. So I would think about it in two ways. We need the right people who are doing the governance, and we have to have the right system, right? And the right system means that how they operate and the accountability mechanism. So, for example, say we are trying to move towards a parliamentary democracy. I think pretty much everybody in this country has kind of figured out that this presidential system is a disaster, basically. The executive president system is not suitable for Sri Lanka. It has simply not worked. So let's take it for granted that that is going to change to a parliamentary system. That itself will hopefully drive better economic governance, because then the government of the day has to come to parliament and be answerable. In our system, the president does not come to parliament. He's only coming by invitation, etc. Second thing is, you know the case that a few months ago, that the opposition was saying the finance minister hasn't come to parliament for 3 months. If you look at the British tradition, there is something called question time on Wednesday. The Prime Minister and his entire team has to come in front of the opposition and answer and debate, basically. We don't have any accountability. So that's the first thing, that if parliament is what is supreme in a country, that we have to restore the parliamentary system. Then we have to have certain institutions, basically, who are independent. Now, one reason we got into this mess is the excess money printing. And we need to have a new monetary law act, which is already drafted. It was on the parliament roll in 2019. It didn't go through, but we need an independent central bank so that basically they focus on their mandate to ensure sound money of the population. Now, what has happened is our value of our money has been completely destroyed, So the soundness of the money is completely gone. So we need these independent institution. So then even on the audit side, basically, we need better audit function, etc. Then we need a budget office, an independent budget office, because if you look at all the budgets in Sri Lanka for the last, 20, 30 years, all the forecasts for revenues are all wrong. They never ever get even close to the forecast, and the expenditure is always higher than what they estimate. So you need an independent budget office that any kind of policies, etc., that government wants, this budget office will it's an intellectual kind of think tank kind of thing within Parliament that tells you what the consequences are of various things. So it's a source of research and a source of education, so that your legislator is better informed, your citizens are better informed. Those are some examples. The next thing is the right people. So, my sense, Shamindra, is we need big electoral reform. And the way we select our MPs is all wrong. Now, I don't know whether you know who your MP in your area is, but if you take where we are sitting at the moment, I don't think, my house is not very far from here. I don't know who the local MP is, because under this Manape system, you are competing at a district level, right? So you don't have, in essence, your local MP, right? So we need to get back to that local MP system where there is greater accountability based on geographic location.
So small electorates, first past the post?
For 2/3 of the seats. And what I believe is that the German system has 2 votes. So there is one version of it where you have a single vote, where 1/3 can come from the PR system and 2/3 through the first past the post. But that means your local MP has to be from the same party. Now, the 2-vote system allows you to keep your party vote different to the local vote.
Right.
So I feel there's a lot of benefit in that system, because, I vote on a particular philosophy or ideology, I give that vote to my party.
And they bring 1/3 of the members on proportional representation.
But my local guy could be somebody from not my natural party, but he's a good guy. He's competent. Then you have a more equitable. Now, this has been tried in quite a number of, I think New Zealand also has this system. This is a German system. It's a slightly different. To me, the more I think about this electoral reform has to happen, because when you have smaller constituencies, right now, typical Colombo is like 2 million people. The amount of money that you need to compete in, because you are trying, Colombo district goes up to like Avisa Vela. So the amount of money that you will need to campaign is hundreds of millions. Now, after this inflation, it will probably be even more. I'm told even in the eastern province, you need a large amount of money because people expect a handout. But when you have smaller electorates, basically, of say 100,000 instead of like 2 million, the amount of money that you will need, the geography is smaller, the amount of movement that you have to have, the transport, the communication, everything is a much smaller number. And then you are not competing with people in your own party to get preferential votes, basically, which is this Manape system. So then you take the necessity for large amount of money to come into Parliament. So, logically, you would think that the need to be corrupt, is the need to be corrupt because you have to fund your political activity, or you want to enrich yourself, basically. So that problem gets much sorted out with this kind of electoral system, first past the post. We need to, and hopefully that will encourage different caliber of people to come and run for office. And they could even run as independents. They don't have to necessarily come through political parties.
Sure. Anything you think you need to add, Murtaza?
So, to me, this is the greatest opportunity in my lifetime. If we mess this up this time around, I'm afraid that we are going to fall way behind all the other nations. There are other countries. What happened in the Asian financial crisis in 1987? Take the example of Thailand. So it's 1997, not 87. and they had a massive crash. The baht went from like 10 baht to 50 or something. Now it's like 30. And somebody said, all the crooks left. So their crisis was different. Ours is a sovereign crisis. But the crisis is of such a enormity that the population is willing to change. Right? So we just need to do the right kind of changes. And people like myself who are involved in a think tank, we have a large role to play to get our message out and especially educate the population out there and kind of try to influence the right kind of system that kind of aligns the incentives so that everybody is working together as a country. And I think the prerequisite, Shamindra, is that we as a country need to come together of what our real ethos is. Because throughout our history, post-independence history, let's face it, we have been quite divisive. All the communities are not together. There have been so many conflicts and insurrections and ethnic conflicts, etc. So the first thing has to be that, our leaders and the population has to come together and identify a national ethos, who we are as a country and as a people, that this is a country for all. So that everybody says we are going to work together to build Sri Lanka, basically. Then we have to set a system that works. So we have to get our constitution, our institutions, our public service, everything to work. We have to even change the public service. We have to try to go back to that old Ceylon civil service. Although it has a colonial overturn, it had certain elements that really worked. You attracted the best people in your country to join the civil service. Politicians couldn't excessively meddle with the civil service. They ran the country. Here, basically, the civil servants are servants of basically the politicians. They are not servants of the people, basically. So we cannot afford to allow this opportunity to go. And our crucial thing is what happens in the next 1 year. Although we are going to continue to suffer and the economic crisis is not going away, we have to fix the other thing. Because the people who have benefited from this system are not going to easily allow it to be changed.